All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is Rishi Manchanda, CEO at Health Begins. We are just going to take a minute to let folks join us. Thanks for all of you who have already started to come into this space. We'll give ourselves another minute before we launch. All right, great. So thanks everybody for joining us today. As I said, I'm Rishi Manchanda, I'm CEO at Health Begins. I'm really honored and privileged to be joined today by three outstanding people, people who I happen to know and admire deeply, and I can't wait for the conversation that we're about to have, especially because of the moment that we're in. I will just ask folks for a little bit of housekeeping for Zoom before we kind of launch in. So please do remember to keep your lines muted. If you have questions, comments, any technical problems, please use the chat function. So the chat will be the main vehicle by which we'll see if you have any questions, concerns, or problems and technically, and we'll be sure to respond to you via the chat. This is going to be a really interactive panel, kind of fireside chat conversation. So we're going to switch out of PowerPoint in a few moments, and you'll be able to see a lot of folks on the line. And so please feel free to put yourself on video. It'll just make it, if it's possible for you, just make it more interactive. Also, please put in your, rename yourself in your Zoom window so we can see your name and your organization. And the last thing is, if you wouldn't mind actually to that point about your name and your organization, using the chat now, just to flex those kind of finger muscles, please put your name and your organization in the chat so we have a good sense of who's showing up. So go ahead and put your name and your organization in the chat now, and that'll give you a good sense to, give us all a good sense of who's on the line today. So with that Zoom housekeeping in mind, I'll go ahead and just review the busy slide here, which is what we had hoped to achieve today. Of course, this conversation is going to take us in a lot more directions and a lot more nuance than what you're seeing on the PowerPoint slide. But we do hope that in this post-election moment that we are able to all come away with a better understanding of the implications of the election results, both for governmental action as well as non-governmental action by civil society organizations, social sector groups, public health advocates, to improve both racial equity and health equity. We hope that we'll all emerge with a better sense of the role and the ongoing need for institutions, as well as for social movements to start to collaborate and move forward, especially as we see a new administration coming into place. And then we also want to walk away, and you'll hear this, I think, from each of our presenters today, our panelists. We'll walk away with at least two specific post-election opportunities, two pivotal kind of top of mind issues that some of you are probably thinking of as well. We want to make sure that we have an opportunity to share. So the reason I'm particularly excited about our ability to have the conversation that we want to have today is because of the people who've joined us. So Salvan Devaraja, who's my colleague, partner in crime at Health Begins, managing director, who brings an incredible diverse background. So thank you, Salvan, for joining. Solange Gould from Human Impact Partners, co-director there. Also really honored. Solange, thanks so much for joining. And then last but not least, Zachariah Mampilli, the Marx Endowed Chair of International Affairs at the Marx School of Public International Affairs at the City University of New York. And also, I'll just append that by saying an old and dear friend. So Zach, thanks for joining as well. So we're going to hear from public health experts, political scientists, health policy and health advocate experts. So I really look forward to this conversation today. And I'm going to give you all a sense, as the moderator role that I'll be playing today, I'm going to give you all now a sense of some of the questions, not all the questions, but some of the questions that we were thinking about addressing today. And again, we're going to address these in a pretty organic way. Some questions, for example, about social movements, and the fact that both social movements and institutions are recalibrating in this moment. What's top of mind for you? So we'll hear from our panelists talking about what's top of mind in a brief moment. And then there's other questions about important lessons and opportunities for our institutions and organizations like public health departments, healthcare systems, community-based organizations, and asking ourselves as institutions about our role, our responsibilities, and our relationship when it comes to social and protest movements. And then particularly with Zach's perspective, Solange's perspective, and Salvana's, getting a sense of what protest movements mean for this moment, what it's meant in the past year in the US, what lessons we can learn from abroad about the importance and the role of protest movements in the ongoing fights to advance public health and social justice. So that is the end of my screen sharing, because I now want to get to it. So we'll start with a lightning round question just to get into this. And the first question that I posed on the screen was the one I want to now pose to our panelists here. As we look at this post-election moment, and your organizations, your institutions, you yourself professionally are recalibrating in this moment, and as we see social movements and institutions doing this more broadly, what's top of mind for each of you? What's top of mind? What challenges, what worries you most in this moment? And also, where are you trying to focus your energy in this moment right now, given what's happening in the political environment at this moment? So I'll start actually with, I'll go to Solange first, and then we'll maybe ask 2 or 3 minutes, Solange, of your responses. We'll go to Zach and then Savin. So Solange, welcome. And if you want to start us off on this lightning round.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so I come from a long career in public health. That's my background. I worked in maternal and child health, climate change, health and all policies, and racial equity, a big range, as well as traditional public health like tobacco and injury prevention. And one thing I learned in my career in public health is that when we worked with community organizers in a very coordinated inside-outside strategy, where we were more like co-conspirators rather than at odds with each other, we got a lot more shit done, frankly, on much more aggressive policies to shape the conditions for health. And so in the current climate that we're in, which is so divided and which is so politically contentious, especially in areas like climate change, housing, economic policy, now that we're post-election, I think we really need to invest in our relationships with social movements who have always been leading the charge for improving the conditions that create health, and really refine our inside-outside strategy between the racial and health equity champions inside and outside of government. And that will really build our collective power. And I think we've been talking about inside-outside strategy for a number of years. But I think in order to really advance things that we know we need, like continuing the moratorium on housing evictions, really strong climate policy, decarceration, not to mention dealing with this deadly pandemic, I think we're going to need to have really, really strong, long-term, trusting, co-conspiratorial relationships with organizers. So I'm gonna stop there and let other people jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Solange. Zach.
Yeah, well, wonderful to be here. Thank you, Rishi, for the invitation, and thanks everybody for the organizing efforts to make this happen. Really excited to be here with all the other panelists, especially. I think I would definitely echo a lot of what Solange is saying, and maybe just frame it slightly differently in the sense that I think what we have been living through over the past 4 years has been, actually just a tremendous expression of the power of bottom-up grassroots social movements. We have, I think, in many ways started to redefine what it means to be a democracy. We are starting to shift away from what political scientists refer to as electoralism, the idea that democracy is simply about casting a vote every 4 years. We've seen unprecedented energy on the streets, literally from the day after Trump was elected. People have been on the streets in more parts of the country, more demographics than we've ever seen in American history. And I think all this has been reflected in the tremendous turnout we actually observed in the recent elections. And so I think, there is a narrative that has taken hold during the Trump era, which suggests that we are living through a period of democratic backsliding. But for me, this has actually been a period where I've actually started to see the promise of American democracy and a vision of American democracy that comes from the streets, that comes from the ground up, that really reflects a more substantive and engaged form of democracy in this current moment. And so I guess my biggest fear and what is top of the mind is how do we sustain that in the Biden era? I think there is a sense, and we've seen this in the past, where as citizens, we tend to view our problems very much at the level of personalities, and we assume that if Trump is gone, then everything is back to normal. And I think that's my biggest concern, is how do we sustain the clear evidence of a massive shift in people's civic engagement that occurred under Trump, not to give him any credit for that. Certainly it was not intentional on his part. But how do we sustain that into the Biden era and ensure that we really start to see progress on a whole variety of issues that we understand in fundamentally different ways, largely thanks to the efforts not of politicians and political elites, but because of ordinary people taking to the streets and really reframing how we think of some very fundamental issues that affect our democracy.
Thank you. That's great. Let's keep this going. Yeah, Salvana, a lot of good food for thought here.
Yeah, thanks, Rishi. And I'm so excited to be here speaking with Solange and Zach today, and also with all of you on the line. We really fully intend for this to be a discussion with everybody involved. I think we've talked about it as a great big cocktail party. So looking forward to everyone's reaction in the chat on this question. I think something that might be helpful is to just describe a little bit of the background that I'm coming from. So my family came to the US under political asylum. So we were fleeing a country and a government that was trying to kill us. And I also worked in the Obama administration. So I worked in federal government in the US. And I know that some of my public statements and actions, including participating in a hunger strike, that expressed distrust of government, was part of why I was asked to be in government at that moment. And so I think kind of keeping those two parts of my experience is what's bringing me to this conversation. Of course, our work at Health Begins, where, among other things, we help healthcare systems and community-based organizations work together to improve social drivers of health on individual, community level, and societal structural drivers of health. And I won't get into all of that here, but I think that what I'm concerned about is similar to Solange and Zach, which is, when we talk about partnerships, we've traditionally talked about them as healthcare systems and community-based organizations, kind of centralized positions of power. What's the social contract that we're trying to build? What's the charter that we're trying to build between institutions and social movements? What does that look like? We already get a lot of questions from healthcare stakeholders about, well, who do I talk to in the CBO? Well, who do you talk to within a social movement? How do you make that part of your fabric? What does that mean? What does that look like? And so those are the questions that I think are consuming me over these days and for the year ahead. And I think also how to broaden institutional muscle around advocacy. A lot of the organizations in our orbit might have, their membership organizations or trade organizations, and they might have federal relations offices. What does it mean to have protest relations? What does that mean for the organization, and how do we flex those muscles into different types of advocacy that's not just focused on the ballot? And I think the final piece I'd add in terms of what's worrying me immediately is, of course, Georgia, because I think all of those other pieces are part of the political asylee part of me, and then the former government worker part of me is like, it's really important for us to get to last Senate seats if we can, because we've seen Biden in a White House with Mitch McConnell in power, even if he was a majority power, and that's led to a lot of harm. It's going to lead to a lot of harm for Georgians and for the nation, and I think for protest help, because one major benefit of Georgia right now is that we get to see some of the successes of groundwork organizing over all these years. And if Georgia is actually able to close these 2 seats, the signal that it sends to the rest of the South is that we are not ceding territory. And I think that's also important. So that's what I'm looking forward to and thinking about.
Sadhana, thanks. And just to echo thanks to Zach and Solange, you've already set this incredible table here for a lot of issues that I think are going to be surfacing. And I think your eyes are probably going where mine are to the chat. And I hope everybody's eyes are going to there, because we're seeing a lot of great answers building on what you guys have also shared about what is top of mind for each of you as well. So keep them coming, keep looking there as we're continuing the conversation. Let me pick up on one of the elements that each of you kind of spoke to, and that's these, if anything, in the past year in particular, and I think what some of you mentioned the past 4 years, it's been two stories, right? Interrelated stories: the story of institutions and the story of social movements. And sometimes some of our institutions and some of the social movements are aligned in response to a common threat by Trump administration policies in the past 4 years. And at times, those very institutions are also the target, rightly so, of social movements to demand that institutions play a more active role beyond the kind of performative declarations that have gone out there, to kind of play a more active role in dismantling structures of oppression and structures of health inequity. So there's this interesting kind of set of two stories at the very least, right, of institutions, and I mean, not just democratic institutions, governmental institutions, but also, healthcare systems, health plans, public health departments, community organizations, and then the social movement. So you've each spoken to this, and I'm curious if we can dive a little deeper. What, with the perspective of health equity and racial equity goals, or that agenda that I think is widely shared among everybody on this line, what are some important lessons? What are some important opportunities for many of our institutions and organizations, as well as the people who are on the line today who have roles in those institutions, to define our role and our relationship better to social movements? I'll go in reverse order here, because I think, Sadhana, you were speaking about, I'm going to target to you first because you were talking about protest relations and some other ideas. So let's expand on that if you don't mind, and then we'll popcorn it.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of lessons that we've learned over the last 4 years, and especially over the last few months of maybe more intense uprisings and political action, that I think we're seeing already play out in a number of institutions. So we've seen the AMA recently pass a Truth and Reconciliation Act through their board to really tackle the questions that are happening around the country. And I think that one of the big lessons is that there is political will to do this work now. One of the big shifts that I've seen over the past year is where there have been internal champions that are interested in raising issues of racial and health justice. They now have that, and maybe Solange, this is a tip to your inside out play, they have that outside pressure to help them build the will internally within their organizations. And I think that's one of them. So the AMA, I know we have a friend of Health Begins, Josie Williams in North Carolina, that's been doing this for years with her health system. She's executive director of the Greensboro Housing Coalition, and she sets folks down and has them talk through, really acknowledging and addressing the harm that that institution may have played in the community that they serve as the first meaningful step towards progress. And yeah, I think those are just a couple of the lessons we've learned through this process. I think the final thing I'll say is the American Public Health Association has also come a long way with their Ending Police Violence statement with evidence-based strategies for decarceration. And so I think we have a lot of models that are exhibiting the lessons learned in this moment and how to protect advocacy efforts around it.
Yeah, Zach, Solange, jump all, either of you want to take that?
Sure, I can go. So I think that, to try to respond to your question and maybe try to frame it in more social sciencey ways, I think that there's a way in which, many people have an understanding of social movements and have generally positive feelings towards how they function, but don't necessarily understand their role in a healthy democracy. And I'll try to use some public health awkward analogies here, because I think social scientists who do study democracy often borrow from the public health literature a lot. We speak of the body politic, we speak of the health of the democracy, and we don't quite understand the role that social movements play in sustaining the health of a democracy, right? And I think much of how political parties view social movements is really somewhat condescending and instrumental. Right, the assumption being that social movements exist to funnel votes into either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, and that's the end point of what the social movement should do. And a lot of these conversations happen within the activist community itself. What should their relationship be, not only to political parties, but to the broader question of democracy in society? And I think if you speak to most social movements, and here I'm talking about genuine social movements, not what sometimes are referred to astroturf movements like the Tea Party, that really are creations of political parties. They understand their roles as an autonomous force within society that is designed much like the discourse around preventive care. right? That they play a constant role in ensuring the health of the body politic. And as such, they're not something that can just be activated and turned off around the election cycle, but that they must be sustained and engaged in actions that build support within the community, not only in moments of crises, but even in moments of health. Right. And so one of the things that has been really interesting, just to give you some concrete examples of how this plays out, if we look at sort of social movements and their relationship to COVID, again, there's one narrative, again, that has been very politicized around Black Lives Matter protests and that these could be vectors of spreading the disease. I don't have any interest in that debate. But I think a lot of people ignore the other ways in which social movements have been very involved in educating the public around COVID-19 responses. So a good friend of ours is Emery Wright. He's the director of an organization in Atlanta called Project South. For those of you who know, the governor of Georgia is an anti-science fanatic, really denied the existence of COVID-19, discouraged his population from wearing masks. And Project South was one of the first organizations, governmental or non-governmental, that was engaged in sustained efforts to educate the community in Atlanta about the risks of COVID-19. And very importantly, actually began to offer testing for COVID-19 even before the public health infrastructure in Georgia was able to do so. If you look, in the African context, I spent a lot of time working with African social movements. We see much the same thing in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's an activist group called the Lucha Movement. One of the first things that they did, they operate in very remote, rural parts of the country. And this is a country which has had often very contentious relationships around public health campaigns, Ebola in particular, where local communities did not trust international interveners who were trying to help them with the Ebola crisis. Lucha was one of the first forces to go out into rural communities and engage in public health awareness campaigns, right, which they understood as fundamentally a political action. And I think all I'm trying to say here is that many of those types of efforts that social movements engage in get no attention whatsoever from the media, from the political elites, because we have thought of them simply as actors that can be activated around elections in the interest of political parties. And we miss all of these things that actually give social movements the credibility they have amongst local communities and that don't generate the attention nor the resources in ways that I think are actually much more essential to the health of our democracy itself.
I'll jump in. When you think about social movements, I'm thinking we all think long-term, right? And so the Trump administration is the result of long-term organizing by the right wing to build power over the last 50 years, at least, both in and out of the electoral terrain. And they built power through their own social movement, from school boards to the Supreme Court. And the thing that binds them together, they have a range of things that they deeply care about. But the thing I think that binds them most together is an ideology, a vision. And it's an ideology of white supremacist authoritarian rule and a commitment to roll back all of the gains that have been made by Black, Indigenous, people of color movements, working class movements. And part of the way that they did that was to dismantle democratic institutions and processes, break everything inside of government that has a protective role, privatize it. And so I want to now refer us to our own health equity movement, which has similarly been going on for about 40 years. We've also made a lot of gains. So our health equity movement has moved from the body as the locus of intervention and telling people what to do and what to eat and exercise and how to have sex and all of that. And we've really moved into a social movement type of public health, where we understand it's the conditions that create health. And one of those is democracy, authentic, deep democracy. And the last 4 years have, and especially the pandemic of the last year, has really pushed us back in many ways, at least 20 years in my opinion. And so what we really need is to not cede that space. So it's great that Biden and Harris won. We're really excited, but we also know that the pull towards conventional solutions to long-standing problems will be very, very, very strong, especially with a split Congress. And so, we want to be realistic about what we can win, but our job, the people on this webinar, is to be not relinquish any more space and to be the strong progressive wing pushing for racial and health equity and to maintain what we've been asking for the last 30, 40 years, continue to push to double down and stand up for housing, decarceration, education, other social determinants where racial inequities are played out. And to, we've really almost ceded the space where traditional public health is not tolerable to half of the population, wearing a mask, telling people to do, what we would have called traditional public health just a year ago. And so this space, we can't cede it. We need to hold this end of it. And, there's things that we can really hold on to. We need to strengthen our public health infrastructure. There's things that we, hopefully we will have newfound respect in science, in health, in this new administration. Hopefully we'll have more power than in the last administration. And there are certain things that we need to be strongly asking for. So just an example is we as health organizations have to be partnering with housing organizers and housing organizations to keep people in houses and demand that the federal administration extend the CDC moratorium, which expires on December 31st. So that's just one example of a call to action. And there are many. And it's one of the problems is that we're gonna have to hold down this end of the health equity movement. We're gonna have to hold down the progressive end of the health equity movement while working with people inside of the new federal administration who may be more centrist. And so that's gonna be a task that we're gonna have to do, hopefully as gracefully as possible. I'll just stop.
I love that. Could I just jump in with one comment, which is that something between Zach and Solange that you've kind of unlocked for me is public health as a political action. I think that's obvious to a lot of people that enter public health. And Solange, you mentioned in previous calls, just how social justice is what brought people into public health. But Zach, your framing of how that's been kind of the root of many social movements around the world, that public health is a political action in itself is really helpful for me, especially as we kind of hear folks around the country saying, oh, a mask shouldn't be political. Well, it's kind of always been political, right? It's always been political. It's why we've entered this field and it's why we're a part of it. And so I loved hearing you say that. Just wanted to mention it.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I'll just kind of react to and again, wearing the moderator hat, encourage any noodling of thoughts or ideas that each of you has on the line here today. Please feel free to use the chat to continue this dialogue, which is incredibly rich. A couple of things that I just want to elevate. Zach, the point you're making about the way in which protest movements, both and social movement organizations like Project South and like Lucha and DRC, the way in which they've leveraged or responded to health crises, right? As not as an afterthought, but as a direct kind of, as an integral element of the reason that they exist, right? It feels to me in some ways a statement about the vacuum or the void that's created by formal government institutions that are failing, right? To respond to needs, particularly needs of the most marginalized, minoritized communities. So there's something really rich there that I would like to unpack, especially as we think about preparing for COVID vaccine distribution allocation, when it comes to contact tracing, when it comes to even demands for improving access to healthcare for all the folks who have delayed care because of COVID and are what we're going to see at some point in 2021 is most likely a surge now of additional care. There's all this pent up demand for healthcare. There's all this coming need for rolling out vaccines and obviously other public health measures. And I think many people right now view those as institutional actions taken by the institutions of formal governmental public health. And yet the examples you provided, Zach, really bring to bear, this question of what does it mean to look at non-institutional actors, social movements, protest movements in particular. And Solange, there's that also speaks to your point about kind of holding down the progressive, holding down these principles, making sure we don't cede territory here. There's something that's what I was kind of wondering about there. So Zach and Solange and then Sadhna, let's unpack this a bit more. What does this mean then for social movements as amplifiers, as deliverers of health services, of public health, not necessarily looking at our institutions only as those organizations that do that?
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely tapping into perhaps one of my biggest concerns about the vaccine, and I'm sure the public health community has given a lot of thought to this. But just to sort of comment on it as an outsider, and perhaps how the discourse around vaccination campaigns and specifically the specter of the anti-vaxxer, right? Much like the has dominated a lot of the discourse in the current moment. We are going to start seeing a lot of think pieces and other analyses around why people refuse to take vaccines, right? It's in their interest, and how can they be so dumb that they refuse to do something that will actually save their lives and protect their own communities, right? And this sort of disdain for the anti-vaxxer that can, I think actually work in very counterproductive ways, right? And my point here is that, yes, as a liberal elite based in New York City, I can understand a lot of that contempt, but I think ultimately our objective here is to try to get the highest rates of vaccination possible. And I often wonder about, is it productive or counterproductive to be so dismissive of such large elements of the population? And my point here is that, even the category of the anti-vaxxer is not a technocratic category. A lot of the time in the public health and medical communities, there's an assumption that technical solutions are sufficient to deal with these sorts of challenges. And so, the debate around the vaccine currently, as far as I've seen, has been, how do we ensure that people have access to this vaccine, because it's so difficult to transport it, especially to remote communities when you need it to be under such extreme conditions in order for it to remain viable, right? And then there's this discourse on the anti-vaxxers and a whole set of stereotypes and assumptions about why they're behaving the way that they are. And I just want to point out, three subcategories of the anti-vaxxer and sort of just highlight how difficult this challenge is going to be, and perhaps why we should start thinking about it currently, right? So when I imagine the anti-vaxxer, of course, there's an assumption of sort of working class whites who have been politicized in rural areas to be hostile to vaccination and public health campaigns as part of the Trump agenda. And I think a lot of the liberal press especially tends to focus on that community as well. But I used to live in Los Angeles, and we know that there's a huge portion of highly educated, wealthy whites in Marin County and other parts of California that are very hostile to vaccination as well. They have not entered really the conversation around anti-vaxxers. Here in New York City, we have certain communities like the Hasidic Jewish community that is hostile to vaccination campaigns as well, because they have hostile relationships around public health issues with the city in general. And then, of course, to come back to the question of race, there are certain African-American communities that are suspicious of public health interventions due to a long history of being treated as guinea pigs by the US government when it comes to public health issues, right? And the solution for this is going to require nuanced and specific approaches that take each community's objections seriously and tries to intervene in ways that actually can make a difference and start to do away with these suspicions and actually encourage the community to participate in vaccination campaigns. And who is going to be able to do that? And one thing that we know from some of the really interesting literature that comes out of anthropology of public health in Africa, is that the trust, the community trust, is perhaps the greatest obstacle in terms of public health campaigns, and that social movements and other local-based organizations that we may not think of as being part of the public health effort are often the only actors who have the kind of trust that can enter into these communities and help them to do what is actually in their interest to do. Right. And so what I would hope is that, as we sort of spend so much time worrying about the technical solution of the vaccine, right? How do we get refrigeration levels adequate so that we can distribute it around the country? That we're also starting to reach out to community organizations, to social movements based in these communities, and starting to do actually the really hard and difficult work of trying to win them over to our sides, not stereotyping them, not diminishing their concerns, some of which may be legitimate, some of which are not, but recognizing that they are going to play an essential role in the success of any vaccination campaign, and that we are attuned to whatever concerns they may have and are starting to address them right now. Right, not in 3 months when we hear these objections and we start to hear these stories and have to go through this whole cycle of asking ourselves, why won't they do what is so obviously in their interest to do? Right? That does not work, and it'll be our responsibility if we fail to do that now.
Solange, yeah, to Zach's point, I mean, and you brought up this point earlier about working with centrists and the Biden-Harris administration, and this is the COVID vaccine question is right up there in terms of one of the most pressing questions and opportunities as well to kind of think about how to bring in social movement thinking, social movement work to help answer some of the very technocratic questions that people are asking right now, and to avoid the very kind of, the very kind of late epiphanies that people might have, like, oh, we should have, could have, would have, engage people and community organizations in that way, around COVID vaccine stuff. And how's this playing out, especially with the work that Human Impact Partners is doing?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. I'll bring it back to your first question. What are you most concerned about? This might be what I'm most concerned about. What we've seen is that health organizations that had long-term, trusting, established relationships with community organizers and community organizations have done much better, because we've seen how health actually has been quite challenged as a field during the pandemic and questioned and seen as the enemy of personal freedom. So I'll just tell like a few stories. One is that there's a health department in California, the Santa Barbara Health Department, who had long-term relationships with agricultural worker organizations, very grassroots, representing mostly Latinx and Oaxacan, Mixtec agricultural workers. And they had long-term, several-year relationships that were working through some of the very difficult issues of trust, very understandable broken trust between a government organization and community organizations. Spent several years working through those, building relationships, getting some small wins. That health department recently put out a health order to protect agricultural workers during COVID in the workplace, to be enforced by the Agricultural Commission. That may not sound like a big deal, but it's actually a super outlier in the world of what we have been able to see for health departments flexing their power. They have a lot of legal authority that they have not used because they've been basically protested, fired, the politics, et cetera. We've also seen, so that's like an example, and then that spread. Ventura Health Department did the same thing to protect agricultural workers. So that's like an amazing example. And we also have seen health departments, and I know you guys have seen this at Health Begins also, where they form partnerships with community organizers to get the word out to the most vulnerable communities in every language, in a culturally competent and with cultural humility. But it's a very much a transactional one-way relationship where the government is asking the community organization to work for them, basically, and to do work for them and to get word out, and to not have a reciprocal long-term two-way trusting relationship. And so I am very concerned that health departments are very excited about these new relationships with community organizers during COVID. That has mostly been helping to get the word out. And I'm hoping that there will be a transformation that happens where they will continue those relationships to build social movement and to build an organizing power to protect racial and health equity. Because I think that could go either way, where people in organizations, in community organizations, continue to feel extracted by the work they're doing during COVID. So I'll just end it with that.
What you're touching on, Solange and Salvana, yeah, I want to get your thoughts on this, and particularly this element, the Salvana alternate to you, obviously reflecting on what everything that Solange and Zach are mentioning in this outline question. But I also want to kind of put a finer point on this role of, what I just put in the chat for us all to kind of ponder. At the same time that we're asking for government and non-governmental institutions, including healthcare, public health departments, to own up to the history of structural racism they have, and dismantle oppressive policies. There's also, of course, these opportunities right now to push and create relationships with in the ways that Solange just mentioned in terms of Santa Barbara. So this is going to take a dance, right? As always, and I'm just curious if that's another element, Salvina, that what your thoughts are as you think about this, especially given your background in both government and non-governmental kind of advocacy.
Yeah, I love this, and I loved just listening to Solange and Zach talk about trust, because I think that's such a crucial point to all of this, right? I think within our institutions that might not be governmental, there's a role to play in building trust by creating those two-way conversation lanes. And that's something that we spoke about early in the pandemic. We've been talking about for a long time, but with our community-based workforce principles, right? We've shared that with our audience, and we can share it again now. But really building that trust with the community, and also inviting them in to inform the policies that need to happen. And I'm hearing something else from Solange, which is also to protect those departments, right? Because we're seeing protests on the other side that are getting people out of office when they're talking about mask mandates, when they're talking about the things that need to happen in order to control the pandemic. And then there are protesters on one side saying that they need to go then. And so how do we protect those officials? And I think it requires trust with community-based organizations that are fighting against misinformation, that do have the trust of their community to help protect that message. And I think that this inside-out play is so important on the federal level, and I can speak from that experience, which is just that in the Obama administration, and I know this will be the case in the Biden administration, that there are offices for engagement. And that's the office that I worked in. And I know that this week it was announced that the director of one of these offices of engagement is the granddaughter of Cesar Chavez. And I know her, just linkage to that name doesn't mean anything, but it is in her blood to have that protest and organizing take to her. And what I'll say is that in these offices within the federal government, there are going to be moderates, but there are also going to be folks that need the directive from the public to be able to shepherd through inside. And this all goes back to Solange's point of the inside out play that's needed, and I think is still possible in a Biden administration. And we really need to hold down that progressive line, because I was in that position many times when internal folks, maybe they were politicals, maybe they were career, wanted to have a regulation go one way. And I could go back and say, you know what, this group says no, and this is why we need to listen. And these are the voices they carry. And so if we are going to say no to them, we better also say why. And if you're not prepared to say why, we can't say no. And so I think really building all of that social capital within our communities is important for the strengthening of the institutions, because ultimately it comes down to money, right? Like we're going to have to go to the federal government because we need money to strengthen these institutions locally to fight this pandemic and to fight misinformation and to build trust. And so we're going to need to know how to exercise those muscles to be able to do that.
Yeah, this intersection of, we've said it in some of our work, and I'll put this link in there to what Salvina referenced about the community-based workforce alliance that we've helped to form. And some of you who've been following the work of Health Begins and your organizations know about this alliance. So food for thought for later. But one of the things that we've said as we've helped to participate and help form this National Community-Based Workforce Alliance is that public health moves at the speed of trust. And what's so, I think it's an interesting bromide, right, as a way to kind of deliver this point, but it's our opening to be able to quickly engage people to think, as many of you have, as each of you have spoken to, about the not just community health workers or community, promotoras de salud, or individual actors in the community-based workforce, but also broader community-based social justice movements and protest movements, and that's the interesting kind of tension that I think is necessary in this moment, right? That if public health moves at the speed of trust, then how do you actually elevate both the individuals as well as the actors, the overall kind of movements right now that have the most trust, while as an institution, doing what is perceived to be allowable, et cetera. So that example for Santa Barbara, the example, Project South, exactly you shared, South, the work you talked about in terms of the roles of the office in the federal government. These are all institutions that then that then either because in Georgia they didn't act fast enough and somebody else had to step forward, or there are institutions that recognized that they couldn't do it and shouldn't do it alone, right? So there's something about social movements, trust, and public health right now that is really kind of surfacing in a really important way. And I wonder, as we're looking at some of the chats now, and I want to pivot now to kind of audience Q&A and a bit more specific. So let's draw our eyes to a lot of the rich kind of dialogue and insights and some of the questions coming in on the chat. One of the things that I'll just kind of elevate is an interesting question. I think it's from Javin. And excuse me if I'm mispronouncing that, Javin, but your point about 20 minutes ago, pointing to Zach, you mentioned, Zach, that social movements are most impactful and credible when they're not co-opted by political parties. And you can see his comment there. The movements are influencers and provide avenues for empowerment, but are not puppets or agents. Yet there seems to be a desire to link the two, social movements and the correct party. If we do that, don't we risk credibility and impact that we want and champion as public health professionals? It's an interesting question from Javin, and I think, feel free to expand on that. And Zach, if you want to start, and then we can popcorn it over to whoever wants to respond.
Yeah, I think it really gets to the heart of the challenge that you all confront as an engaged community, right? And the way that I think about it is the question of the autonomy and independence of social movements and their relationship to the health of the democracy itself is fundamental, right? So where I started off was sort of critiquing the way in which we've reduced democracy to what we call electoralism, the idea that the only measure of the health of democracy is elections. I mean, you look at the media obsession around democracy, the whole discourse around, that we've all been living through for the past year, daily polling results. You could probably tell me the outcomes of the polls in Kenosha, Wisconsin right now, if I asked you, and that I think is a reflection of the weakness of our current discourse, right? We spend so little time thinking about social movements, thinking about the everyday practices of democracy, that we, it's kind of, you miss the forest for the trees, right? The social movements are doing all this incredible work. They're helping rejuvenate the democracy in very fundamental ways. And then we reduce them to say, well, what's their effect going to be on the Georgia Senate race, right? As if that's the only reason that they are in existence. And I think that it's not our fault, right? We have been conditioned to think of democracy in this very, very limited, electorally focused manner, right? And I think one of the things I hope that we can all start to do is to reconceptualize our own relationship to democracy itself, move away from the question of a right to vote. Obviously, a right to vote is important, right? But democracy is not just about voting. I mean, Iran has regular elections, but we don't consider it to be a democracy. And that's for good reasons, because they lack other components, which I might suggest are even more fundamental to the conception of democracy that I would want to center, that I would want to experience as an American citizen, right? Things like a right to free speech. And so some of you have talked about, the question of technology and how that shapes our capacity to express ideas. I mean, how many of us are thinking about the testimonies of Facebook and Twitter in front of the US Congress right now and linking it to some of these bigger questions about the health of our democracy, right? But we should be. Right? A right to a free assembly, right? Again, we know that that's a foundational value of any healthy democracy. Yet, how many of us are thinking about that, right? How many of us get annoyed when protest movements, turn violent, and all of a sudden we're like, well, what is this going to do to the Democratic Party's chances for elections, right? These are fundamental questions that we need to give at least equal weight, because I would say that they are the better metrics for the health of a democratic society than merely the capacity to hold elections. And social movements are often that force within society that are pushing the boundaries on these issues to the most. So we start to understand the health of our democracy when we see how city and local governments crack down on, say, Black Lives Matter protesters, right? Using this specter of violence as a justification for why they should not be allowed to exercise their constitutional right to assemble. Right? And so how do we preserve that space? How do we fight as strongly, when we stop thinking of social movements instrumentally, and they no longer seem to play this role in mobilizing voters to go out and vote, can we retain that level of concern about their capacity to function as a fundamental metric of the health of our democracy, that we seem to lavish on them, when we start to think of them as playing an important role for the correct political party. Right. For me, I want healthy social movements. I want autonomous, independent social movements that are rooted in local communities, that are not really just the projects of venal billionaires, but that really represent and fight every day, even when it's unpopular, even when it's not pretty, for the interests of their community. Yep. And that to me is the biggest challenge for how we think about social movements and their relationship to democracy generally.
So let's come back to this point about then if social movements, and as we know, it's not if, we know that social movements are such a necessary and vibrant element and an anchor, right, to this work if we're truly thinking about the health of democracy and the health of the public, right, that these dual interests right now, this conversation certainly is kind of focused squarely on, and rightly so, on the social movements and the power of social movements. The question that I then posed to Sadhana and Solange is, based on what Zach is kind of sharing from the political science perspective and what he's just kind of given voice to, let's make this concrete. What does it mean then for the healthcare institutions that Health Begins and many of our allies, work with and support, and the people that are on this line right now who work in those healthcare institutions? Solange, what does it mean for the public health department, employees, or the public health, advocacy organizations, in terms of, how these institutions, right, can position, can both position themselves, people within them can position themselves to now anchor to and help support authentically, right, social movements, rather than either ignore them or try to co-opt them. What does this mean concretely in terms of, the people on the line today, and what our agency is as institutional actors?
Sana, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can give some initial kind of thoughts that are coming to mind for me, which is that I think a lot of it does come down to messaging, right? Like there's a strength in the message of social movements that are happening within communities. And I think that and maybe this is the point that was made by the audience members, that there might be a detriment to when it gets linked to partisanship. And so that's the work of the champion, is to be able to really leverage the strength of its association to other movements or other parties when it is helpful, and then decouple it from that when it's not. Because I would say, and this might be a question to Zach, is that I think a lot of the social movements we're seeing right now are not partisan, right? They're being labeled as such, but inherently in the movement leaders' philosophies, they're not saying this is part of the Democratic Party, this is part of the Republican Party, but they're saying this is what our people need, and whoever wants to get us there is welcome to join us to get us there. And so, and for all of us that are working within institutions, for us to be able to say, look, these are the actual issues, and you can apply a partisan frame to it if that's helpful for you, but let's figure out how to address these calls to action and these issues that are being raised by these organizers, because that'll ultimately get us to better serve the community. So I think that's where my mind is going.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, where my mind is going is that people in social movements are also getting into elected positions in government. And, you think about what happened this last week with the Democratic caucus coming out against the progressive arm, and AOC having to respond to that. And this sense that the Democratic Party is tearing itself up, when in fact, we're not monolithic. It looks like the Republican Party is Trump right now, which I think is very dangerous for them. But in fact, the Democratic Party has always been a combination of social movements, independent social movements who hold government accountable, organizations who hold government accountable. And lately we've seen more and more people actually getting into electoral politics from social movements and bringing them into government. And I think that's great. I don't think we've seen the Squad, for example, getting co-opted. I think they do a very good job of their own of doing inside-outside strategy, of saying, these are the values that we hold dear. This is the future vision that we hold dear, and we will not cede space, even though we are now inside the halls of power. And so I think that I think of it that way. And I think what I think we really need is, you know, a vision, an ideological glue, sort of like how I said the right has an ideological glue that holds them together. We don't need to be as monolithic as that. I don't ever want us to be monolithic like that. But we do need a unifying narrative, a vision, because I think everyone on all sides are actually done with what we have now. That seems very clear. And so I think we need to have space to reconcile our differences amongst people who identify as progressives and as moderates, and study the areas where we substantively do not agree around things that drive health, and have principled and quiet discussions like, what does it actually mean to divest from incarceration and invest in health? We have seen that defund the police was like held up as one of the big you know, dividers in this. But actually, where are some areas where we agree about investing in health and defunding from policing and incarceration? Green New Deal, couldn't say those words. Banning fracking, couldn't say those words. And yet we know that those are things that are deeply harming people's health and that can, you know, deeply invest in people's health. So we need to have conversations where we say, what do we actually think of a Green New Deal? What do we want to call it? And it's not that I think we should be co-opted, but we do need to reconcile differences by having principled, quiet discussions and come to some agreement. And then, because then we can be co-conspirators in that inside-outside way and not actually be torn apart, which I don't want to see happen.
Well, time has flown by. We're about 4 minutes from the top of the hour here, and I know that all of you have a hard stop, both our panelists as well as everybody who's joined. There are some concrete opportunities that have been brought up, you know, from the Georgia Senate runoffs to the more ending in the moratorium, the CDC moratorium on evictions, and opportunities to mobilize around that. I've also seen our friends from Public Health Awakened and Human Impact Partners put in a couple of additional events here, including a town hall that's happening on December 15th with a Right to City Alliance work. So I invite everybody now, you know, if you're particularly in your own individual work, in your institutional work, aware of a current action, especially an action that aligns with the thrust of this conversation around, you know, ways to center and elevate social movements in the fight for health equity, please put those calls to action in there now. And we'll, in the summary of this call, we'll collate some of these calls to action and share them with everybody just as an additional way of sharing information. I think that where you landed, Solange, and what everybody, Salvan, you spoke to, and Zach, you've spoken to as well, for me, one of the biggest takeaways and what's resonating deeply is these opportunities now to expand both our literacy when it comes to political engagement, what democracy looks like in the way that Zach and others have spoken about, like expanding and getting more sophisticated as public health and healthcare professionals, right? Speaking about the opportunities here, as Lowell put it here, you know, political action, not partisan action, right, is okay. And so for people who say health should be apolitical, or healthcare or public health should be apolitical, it's time to get what resonates with me about this conversation is that that's far too simplistic, far too binary, right? We need to move well past that. The other is about concrete institutional actions and expanding the repertoire of a possibility here for us, especially as we kind of mobilize with social movements or as institutional actors and social movement participants. For example, divestment, Solange, you know, will we see in the next few months, the next few years, more calls for a divestment campaign so that healthcare institutions who have a lot of money, public health departments and others are participating in broader calls for divestment to dismantle, you know, oppressive structures? Are we going to see efforts in the public health community to support redistricting reforms, right? The very reason that some people from social movements who went into electoral politics and came up short in this last election cycle is not necessarily because of a failure of excellent campaigns, but because the efforts of the last 10 to 15 years of, you know, drawing congressional districts in ways that suit, you know, particular outcome. So those are as structurally oppressive as redlining issues have been, right? So do we need to start thinking about public health and healthcare showing up in these broader movements to restructure the institutions of democracy and even how, you know, districts are formed? So I think it raises for me a lot of interesting, you know, possibilities for us far beyond just what it means to show up and vote, or support a particular party, or even to actually, show up in your individual institutions and have conversations around, what's possible now. This has been an incredible conversation here. I'll give like 30 seconds to each of you now just to give some parting thoughts, shout outs, whatever comes to mind right now as we wrap up here. So I'll go to Sadhana, Zach, and Solange.
Yeah, I just want to express my gratitude. I think this conversation has been helpful for me personally, just kind of unlocking about what the role could be for us and our institutional partners to play. And I think it just gives weight to the importance of continuing these conversations in the year ahead as a way to continue the fight, regardless of the administration, because I think it's been artfully said that it's not all about who's in office or who's out of office, but how we leverage power around that. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been really wonderful to participate in this conversation. I think that, as is clear from all the wonderful work that you all are doing, public health is a political issue. We as social scientists sometimes, lose sight of a more encompassing understanding of the political. And I encourage you to talk to your local political scientists, and I will encourage my colleagues to engage with the public health community, because I think we all need to start paying more attention to the intersections between these different spaces, and the more that we allow ourselves to be put into these silos, the less effective we are as a movement. So I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I hope that we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to everyone here. Thank you so much for the thoughtful chats. We made so much progress in this country. We kind of held back something electorally, and we also have much more work to do. Direct action, uprisings, long-term organizing, economic experiments, policy experiments, and being courageous. And so one thing our field is gonna be able to experiment with most in this next 4 years is being courageous. So I'm excited to have this conversation to encourage all of us.
Amen to that. Thank you all, to Solange, to Sadhana, to Zach, to everybody who's joined. Thank you guys for joining today. This is certainly not the last time we're going to have this conversation, so stay tuned, and obviously just keep on keeping on with this question now of how to link ourselves to and support social movements in the fight for health equity in this new moment. Thanks, you guys. We'll talk to you soon.